in a sense, three different organizations working sort of together to make good sense of this evening. One is obviously the publisher, World Scientific. The other is the Institute of Civilization Studies, where our author has had a very long and happy association. And the last but not the least, I hope, is our own university, Singapore Management University, with the Wikimi Center doing most of the logistical arrangements. So in advance, if anything is a little bit amiss, like we are 2 seconds late or anything, I beg your indulgence. But to get things moving, just to say that we do a lot of book launches. And this is obviously one that is very significant because the author is not only distinguished in the many different fields, but he also is not afraid to actually speak his mind, in spite of the fact that he has been, and I beg your indulgence, good sir, a doyen of the diplomatic service for a long, long time. I was told by someone that I don't make a good diplomat because I'm too straightforward and a bit blunt. That I need to refine everything a little bit. But I think in that world, it is difficult to get very frank and honest responses to very, very difficult situations. And I think what we're witnessing today is the launch of a book which brings together a very open, honest, and frank discussion of different issues. And with that, it's now my pleasure to invite my president, Professor Arno de Meyer, to give the welcoming address. Yeah.
Good evening, Your Excellency, all the friends of Jürgen Müller, and also all the friends and students of SMU and from the other organizations, ICS and others that are here tonight. Welcome to SMU on this Friday evening. It's always great to see you here, not only because we can bring people together on a platform where we can interact with each other, have a good discussion, but I'm also happy because, as Kirpal knows, I love book launches. I think it's the role of a university to be a platform for discussion. It's the role of the university to bring people together that will disagree with each other and have a good interaction with each other. And a book lounge is usually an opportunity for doing that. So I think it's great to have that here. Now, I had the opportunity to have coffee last week with the author, with Mr. Müller, and he gave me the book, so I had a bit of a preview of the book. And that was last Thursday, I think, or something like that. So I had my weekend to go through the book and start reading it, because I thought I have to say something on that evening, on that Friday evening. And I have this quick calculation for you. That is, I'm actually an avid book reader, but given my busy life, I can sort of do one book a week, not more than that. And if I assume that I read from my 8 years old till I will be 78, which is actually optimistic because I have to live that long, but assuming that my eyesight goes far enough, I will have about 70 years of book reading, times 50 a year. I give myself 2 weeks of holiday. That's only 3,500 books a year in a life. That's not a lot when you think about it. That's not that much. So my advice to anybody who reads books is, if you start reading the book and you don't like it, put it aside. Don't waste your time, because otherwise you're not going to be able to do your 3,500 books. I tell that story, and I mean it, by the way. I tell that story because I took the book and I thought, I will start reading, and maybe I set it aside as one of those books that are not going or not doing well. But this was wrong. That was a wrong assumption. I started reading over the weekend, and I read quite a lot of what Mr. Müller, Jürgen Müller, has been writing. Not only because he gave me the book and is teaching at SMU, and I felt obliged to do so because he's one of our faculty members, but actually because it's quite interesting. Because, and I will not steal your power for the guest of honor or the debate, but you really touched on all the issues that are hot buttons today, right? Issues like resources and energy, the role of information technology, the fact that we go from a resource-rich to a resource-poor world, but from an information-poor to an information-rich world, the geopolitical tensions around us, but elsewhere in the world, transnational governance, which is actually a very important issue, national and religious sectarianism, international trade and finance, and I could go on and on and on. And in the book, you really touch on a number of very, very important issues, which I actually live with as a citizen, and for which I would like to have some inputs. The other thing that it was interesting reading because it gave me some information. The other thing that I found actually quite interesting is that, and this is maybe not what you meant, but this is a book that has a certain random access. you don't have to read it from the beginning till the end. You can go in the middle and say, oh, this is an interesting chapter, or this is an interesting topic, and you go to the end, and actually then you can say, maybe I should go back to the beginning. And that sort of my little sort of small, sometimes contrarian personality that as a good academic wants to go against the mainstream, actually that is quite pleasant that I can actually read a book in a different way. Now, when I read the book, I see, and there I go along with what Kirpal said, that the author is a quite opinionated person. He has strong opinions, right? Opinions with which I not always agree, I have to say. But at least he makes me think. And maybe that's more important than anything else. So I'd like to congratulate you, Jürgen, for the book that you've written. It really made my weekend, in the sense that I read it with a lot of interest. And I'm probably going to continue reading it because I haven't read it all. And you gave me a good time. But I must say, sometimes I was saying, I would like to have him here to tell him he's completely wrong here, right? But that's part of the fun of being a bit contrarian and trying to stimulate good thinking. Congratulations, as I said, and for the rest of you, have a good evening here at SMU.
Thank you very much, Prof. Mayor. And if I may say so, I know if you're going to be engaging with the panel afterwards with a lot of views, that'd be really interesting because we've got that coming up as a thing for the later part of the evening. But now, let's hear the contrarian say a few words, and the author himself, Professor Jürgen Moller.
Dear Arno Meyer, thank you very much. I'm sorry if I have spoiled your weekend. That was not the intention. Dear guest of honor, dear panelists, and Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. There was some reference to my past in diplomacy, and maybe you don't know, but in a real diplomat, a genuine diplomat, is a person who thinks twice before he says nothing. And you reach the pinnacle of the profession when you can stay silent in 5 languages. But at least after I have retired from the profession, I have broken that tradition. Well, writing a book is like building a ship. Launching a book is like launching a ship. You start with the keel, the spanners, the plates of steel. You get the hulk of the ship, the hulk of the book. You know more or less how it's going to look, but you're not absolutely certain. And you stand there in the shipyard and you look at the ship and you wonder whether it can float. Suppose you have built a ship that cannot float. Suppose you have written a book that nobody wants to read. So what do? You need to launch it. You need to get a godmother, a sponsor, somebody who can swing the bottle of champagne, so to speak, as you do with a ship. Because if you don't do that, it will be an unlucky ship, an unlucky book, pursued by fate. So it will run into other ships, disturb traffic. So I was looking around and I was fortunate to find guest of honor to do that. The chairman of Shell companies in Singapore, Mr. Lee Soo-young, who for many years been a very close and good friend. Who else? I mean, he's ferrying oil around the world in enormous quantities in so many ships, so he must know how to do it. So by asking him to do it, I was on the safe side. Good. Now we launch the ship and we relieve it can actually float. What then? Then you make the superstructure of the ship, the decks, the chimney, the mast, the bridge, the radar, all these things. You paint the ship, you stand and look at it, it looks fantastic. Like when you have written all the chapters in the book, you actually look at the book and you feel very happy. But then with, like the ship, you get worried because you have actually to get the ship from the shipyard to the high seas. Suppose it runs aground, that it heals a shoal or a reef. Suppose the book that has taken so long time to write actually sits there in a mud bank. So what to do? You look around, you want a pilot. But the book was so precious for me that I decided that I needed 3 pilots. And I got them 3 persons to the panel to make sure that the book is ferried from the shipyard to the high seas, where hopefully it can make it so that stormy waters are transformed into calm waters. As I have always forgotten who made the song many, many years ago when I was young. Well, I'm still young. That's how I feel it. But somebody had a song many years ago called Bridge Over Troubled Waters. I want the book to be some kind of bridge over troubled waters. So I found the 3 pilots, Manu Bascan from Centennial, Vikram Khanna from the Business Time, and Ho Ming Kit from the Singapore Business Federation. Then I can really calm down, and I have nothing else to do but to say a few words about the book. My book, my ship, has 6 decks. People talk about a mountain of depth. They're completely wrong. Depth is not a mountain. Depth is a lower deck in a ship, dragging the ship down so it cannot maintain a high speed. Depth means we are in for a decade or 2 with lower growth. Not necessarily low growth, but lower growth. Unfortunately, debt has to be repaid, paid back. You can only do that by saving more. If you save more, you consume less, which means that economic growth will be lower. We will see that for 10 or 20 years. Something completely new for the global economy that has been used to a trend growth of 4–4.5% will go down to, let's say, 3.5%, and we will see the United States, China with lower growth rate. What to do about it? My next deck is scarcities. We are moving from distribution of benefits, more every year, and expectations create expectations. To burden share, less materialistic consumption. Find out how we turn the economy around from looking at more to realizing that we are actually having less to distribute. How do we do that? I do not envy politicians who are in the grips of economists, themselves caught by an economic philosophy that always speaks about growth and distribution, when actually we are facing the exact opposite way. How do we cope in a world with less? That problem is aggravated by my third deck, which is that the world is actually out of synchronization. It is an anomaly that the world's savings are to be found in Asia. There's nothing wrong in the fact that the Asians save, but it should actually be the rich countries. It should be the United States. It should be Europe that saves. The problem for the global economy is that the relatively poorer countries are exporting capital to the relatively richer countries. The global system is not geared to that. The whole model which we operated is actually operating as if it should be that the rich countries are financing the poor countries. An enormous problem institutionally and economically to cope with. Open Straits Times, Business Times, excuse me, we come open Business Times every day, and you will see a debate about what is going to happen when the Fed in the US starts to tamper with quantitative easing. The problem is that then money will flow out of Asia. A real big problem, because it's non-synchronized. The next one is the shift to an new economic model, which actually means that we will have to realize that the Washington Consensus, what I call the American style of capitalism, and there's nothing wrong, it's not value-related words, will have to be replaced by something else because the model does not deliver any more. An economic model and a political system is judged by how it delivers. And the present system does not deliver anymore, which obviously means that people are starting to look at other possibilities, other models, other systems. One of the problems, the fifth deck, is that we have a global system. But the global system is there to, let's call it, project not only American power, but the American model. But when the American model is running out of steam, how do we actually adjust the global model? How do we actually make it so that countries, groups of countries, are not adopting divergent economic policies? It makes no sense that confronted with a global financial crisis, the US is pursuing one policy, the Eurozone another policy, Japan a third policy, Britain a fourth policy, China a fifth policy. That makes a mockery of economic globalization. How can we ever envisage that economic globalization can survive in such circumstances? We need some kind of global governance. And the sixth step is even more difficult. We need a different kind of corporate governance. Corporate governance is defined, even if we don't like to hear it, by pursuing profit. We use nice words like corporate social responsibility, corporate citizens, and it's all very nice. But basically, corporations around the world look at profits. Not only that, we have learned over the last 4 or 5 years that they are greedy. They do not pursue a high morale. Actually, how can we expect the rest of society to pursue a, let's call it, rightful course when they look upon the business sector out of synchronization, pursuing profits, instead of seeing what it can do for society? Some kind of new corporate governance saying that our enterprise, our corporation is here to be part of society, contribute to the development of society, do something for society. The ultimate objective of everything we do in the enterprise is to do something good for society. This has disappeared completely. Very few corporations or enterprises feel themselves anchored, rooted in a local community. They feel themselves as part of economic globalization without any kind of governance, transferring their economic transactions depending on where they can get the lowest wage cost, the lowest tax rates. They don't want to pay tax. All this is contributing to a corporate governance that also threatened the very kind of economic globalization. Read again, Business Times, see article after article after article about how international institutions and countries try to catch all the big multinational companies not paying taxes. These are my 6 steps, and with giving you a little bit of glimpse of what I write, I hope that I have lived up to the expectations created on my behalf of being a contrarian. But thank you for your attention.
Wow, a real learned scholarly discourse. Brief as it may be, it promises the largesse that the book promises us, so that's really very good. It's now my great pleasure to call upon our guest of honor, Mr. Li Zhang, to come and give his guest of honor speech. So,
Professor Moller, author of the book, Professor Arno de Meyer, President of SMU, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm pleased and honored to be here for the launch of my good friend's book. I've known Jürgen for many years, and we do keep in touch on a regular basis. We always have very interesting and enjoyable conversations on a variety of subjects. And although I think we all know him as having a long-standing interest in economics and politics, I assure you that our conversations cover a very wide range of subjects and interests, the latest developments of which always come back to impact on politics and economics. Of course, the normal view of an economist is that he is not superstitious. So I understand from his Danish background why he uses shipping as an analog for launching of a ship, but why the worry about the launch and the pilots, that's a bit unusual for an economist. And I think although economists are blamed for many things, we are not often blamed for holding on to politicians. So I think politicians, part of the issue today is that they don't seem to be held on by anything. But I think in a sense, this book, is similar to many of the conversations we've had, and Professor Dimaya has referred to the fact that it's really a collection of vignettes almost on various subjects, which has proven to be extremely interesting. I think it explores many different themes and subjects, always topical, always interesting. And again, I think it reflects many of our conversations. It always gives the author's point of view, but it doesn't necessarily rubbish other people's views. I would like to say that Jürgen has always struck me as that most European of advocates, always advocating a world view from a European point of view. I think he has demonstrated, and I had the privilege also of reading his earlier book. He's always been interested in the issue of scarcity. In fact, scarcities. And the reason why scarcities is important, I think, is not only because it is not the singular, it is plural, but also it is not just the concept of scarcity, but it is the everyday intrusion of scarcities into real life. Because, economics is that one of the most, it has been said to be one of the most conceited, maybe the most conceited of the social sciences. And so we really need to get away from thinking about things in the abstract and really bring it down to real life. I think the other approach that is often taken in economics, and this is true particularly of late, is the resort to ever more and more mathematical modeling to try and understand ever-increasing complexity. And I think this has, of course, in the building of the models, given us many more understandings of the relationships. But I think the shortcomings of quantitative methods are always that we may miss some key understandings. And I think that is something which I've always enjoyed in my discussions with Jürgen, because whilst we may not always agree with his views, I don't think we ever can accuse him of being too theoretical. I think the other couple of aspects I think that he has referred to in his book and also in his address, global debt. I think global debt has really grown to be a significant threat to economic stability. I think he has explored both the causes and also suggested various approaches that might be taken to the resolution of the debt in several of his articles, and has really called for new thinking. And I think it is timely that today, even as we see some, perhaps you could say, hopeful signs of a recovery in the global economy, that we do not simply revert to accepting the established economic models, but we continue to look at what new approaches might actually yield better ways. I think the other aspect which Jürgen referred to really refers to the breakdown of trust, and in a way, the breakdown of trust not just between electors and governments, but between consumers and people who supply the businesses. And I think this breakdown of trust is indeed one of the societal phenomena. It's not just a political issue, but I think it's a sociological issue which has really changed in a way the relationships among organizations in society. I would refer to some of the scenarios work which we've done in Shell, and we have in our latest approach mountains and oceans, so the sea again. And in the oceans, it's really one where perhaps not only because of debt and death, but really it is the people who actually move and make the decisions, as opposed to mountains where the elites continue to try and command the heights. And I think that's a useful analogy perhaps for some of the discussions which we may have today about the breakdown of trust. So I will not comment further on the book. I will let my more learned colleagues do so more fully later. But I wish to congratulate Jürgen on this latest collection of all his work. I wish all of you here tonight a very enjoyable evening discussing and, of course, reading his book. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lee. Now, to symbolize the launch of the book, the author is going to present Mr. Lee with a copy of the book. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's all. Congratulations. Good job. Thank you. May I invite both Mr. Lee and our author to occupy the two extreme chairs over there, please? And I'm also going to use this opportunity to invite Manu Bhaskaran to come forward as the moderator of the panel and introduce.
First of all, it is a privilege to be here to participate in this launch by Ambassador Mullah, a man whose views I have greatly respected and whose insights I've followed for quite some time. Much has been said about the book. I think that there are a few things that struck me about the book. I think, first of all, to have put so much of the broad sweep of all the trends that are unfolding, it's going to have an effect on the global economy. One easy-to-read book, that in itself, I think, was quite an achievement. And but beyond that, I think for someone sitting in this part of the world and looking out from Singapore to the world, I think there are three things that struck me about the book. First of all, I think he's given a much more nuanced and balanced assessment of a number of challenges that the global economy faces. In particular, I think a standout case is his analysis of the Eurozone crisis, which you find in part 4 of the book. Quite a lot of the media commentaries and so on come from a fairly, cynical, skeptical perspective of the Eurozone, reflecting some of the origins of the commentators. But I think Ambassador Mullah does us a great service by giving us, first of all, the historic background to the Euro, why it was created, the Latin Monetary Union, the Scandinavian Union, and so on, what happened there. He also gives us a much more objective assessment of the future trajectory of the Euro, arguing why the Union will go ahead, even though there might be problems with the European Union. The Eurozone itself is going to continue. And I think that has some lessons for us in Asia, and particularly in ASEAN. And he actually works out the lessons for Asia that emerged from the Eurozone crisis. Second, his identification of growing scarcities that the world economy faces, I think is especially helpful in Asia, where I think there has not been sufficient discussion of these issues. He identifies 5 critical areas of scarcity: food, commodities, energy, water, and a clean environment. And he makes a vital point that the efforts to address these scarcities should not be done in isolation, because they all interact. If you try to step up food production to address the problem of scarcity of food, you're going to use up a lot of water, which is going to be increasingly scarce. So these things cannot be treated in isolation, and I think that's a very interesting insight for us. And he basically argues, therefore, that there's a need for a new model of the economy which takes into account all these complex trade-offs and interactions. Finally, at a time when ASEAN is increasingly integrating, he's given us several insights into how best to structure this integration. His chapter on how ASEAN can stay relevant, I think, is particularly interesting. He identifies 7 areas which ASEAN should focus on in learning from the successes and failures of the European integration project. most important of this was his emphasis on ensuring that building economic integration was seen to be improving the daily lives of the common folk, a mistake that may have been made in the European project to some extent. There are many other insights which ASEAN's builders should take to heart, such as the ability to adjust and adapt to different circumstances, and the preconditions for regional institutions to succeed. So in short, this book rewards the patient reader with many insights and lessons. Many of us here in Singapore will find it a refreshing and important contribution to understanding the big forces that affect our destinies. So with that, let me maybe open up to Vikram and then to Minke, maybe 5 to 7 minutes of comments. Then we will talk.
Thank you, Manu, and congratulations, Jürgen, on the launch of yet another book. I've had the pleasure of knowing Jürgen ever since he was ambassador of Denmark and Singapore in the 1990s. I remember he was here during the Asian crisis, and we had some very good discussions on the crisis during that time. But what is really impressive is how his post-diplomatic career has taken off as a writer and how prodigious he has been. A steady stream of articles and books. He's been a regular contributor to the Business Times. He's been a regular contributor to the Business Times over the years. So, in fact, I've actually had the sneak preview of many of these, the contents of this book, which have been published in BT over since 2009, 2010. So, yeah. I've always been stimulated by what he says, along with I think many other people. I have not always agreed, and I will make clear where I do not agree with Jürgen. But I have always enjoyed reading his stuff. He always, as Professor Meyer said, makes you think, and this book will do that to you. I'll just pick up on just a few themes. The book covers an enormous, mind-boggling range of topics. I mean, it's got the Eurozone, United States debt, scarcities, governance, corporate governance, and so on. So I've been a bit selective in what I have chosen to discuss. I think one of his big themes in one of his essays is that the free market economy has run its course. Now that, I would agree with that, but I think we should caution ourselves that this happens in cycles. Ideology is a very cyclical thing. From the post-war period to the 1970s, Keynesianism was pretty much the ideology of the day. You had reasonable amounts of regulation and intervention, but then problems arose. You had inflation in the late 70s, brought on partly by the Vietnam War, partly by the OPEC oil price hikes, partly by the commodity price boom. And then there was an embrace of monetarism being the sort of the free market ideology espoused by people like Milton Friedman and so on. And that was embraced in the UK and in the United States by the Reagan and Thatcher administrations. And that the free market ideology pretty much carried on. Monetarism fell by the wayside after a few years, but the free market ideology carried on pretty much into the 2000s. And in the 1990s, it was strengthened by financial deregulation and so on. And again, during the Clinton administration, and then you had Alan Greenspan, avowed free marketeer, who was the chairman of the Fed, and we had a long period of low interest rates, culminating in 2009, and then we had the crisis, the global financial crisis. And then, of course, the crisis has brought on its own complications and its own backlash against the free market, and you're now turning more towards a more regulatory environment. We now have had things like, well, earlier we had Sarbanes-Oxley for corporate governance after the Enron scandals, 2001, and now we have the Dodd-Frank legislation to rein in the sort of financial sector's excesses, although some people say that is not enough, doesn't go far enough. But I think we're certainly now on the road to a sort of more regulated. I think regulation has become respectable and desirable. And the free market ideology has definitely, as Jürgen points out, not run its course, but in retreat. Though, as I say, if you look at the economic history, it's pretty cyclical. Now, Jürgen also raises a very important point about inequality. Inequality has become the big issue of our time. Over the last 20 years or so, the share of wages relative to profits has gone down in general. And in Asia, in Singapore included, we've had asset inflation, asset price inflation, and inequality. And this has led to a rise of nationalism and populism, including here, I should say. And in such situations, when faced with these problems of inequality and the lack of access, people often reach for the wrong answers. I mean, they start looking for enemies in foreigners. They look for Harvard graduates, enemies, scholars. These are all enemies. They don't look for the right answers. The right answers are things like strengthening social safety nets, improving opportunities in education, changing the tax structure perhaps to make it more progressive, reining in things like executive pay, which has really gone way beyond reasonable levels. So these are the sort of right answers, but people don't reach for them. People reach for the easy targets and so on. And Jürgen, I think, makes this point about we need to make policy making more inclusive. He suggests bringing in players such as MNCs, NGOs, and perhaps labor groups to participate in policy making rather than being outsiders. And I think that's a very constructive suggestion. And he also talks about how technology and social networks have empowered individuals to raise their voice and take on governments as individuals. And I think this will be a huge challenge for governments, including in Singapore, to deal with the sort of comeback at an individual level by people, social networks, on blogs, online media, and so on. And I think that's a challenge. China. Jürgen has a few chapters on China. I think he's astute to caution that the rosy state of affairs that China has enjoyed over the last 30 years may not continue in the face of there also rising inequality and lower growth. And there's tension between social policies and the sort of the pro-market policies that China has been pursuing. And one could add to that the challenges of unwinding excessive investment. China has had really excessive investment over at least the last decade. So 50% of GDP goes into investment, and that has to be unwound. And he asked the intriguing question, will the Chinese non-market model be successful and pose a challenge to the Western model? I'm not sure it will. I think we don't know enough about major parts of the Chinese economy. We don't know enough about China's private sector, which is actually quite dynamic, but it's a black box in many ways. We don't know much about China's shadow banking system, which actually is many people suspect is quite large, and which has arisen out of a market need to supply financing to the private sector, which is deprived of access to the state-controlled banking system. We don't know much about that. We don't know the extent to which there is a property bubble. We know there's a bubble in many parts of China, many cities, but we don't know how bad it is and how widespread it is. And we don't know what the consequences are going to be of past overinvestment. This has to be unwound. And there's going to be, quite likely, a glut in many things, steel, cement, capital goods, and so on. And that's going to come on stream. So a lot of things, and there's, of course, the political issues. There's the corruption, the cronyism, and how China is going to cope with that with a new leadership and a populace that is informationally empowered. It is, despite controlled media, China has very, very strong social networks. And so that's all those challenges have yet to play out. So I'm not sure China will supplant, China's model will supplant America's. And now I must come to, I'm afraid, the areas where I disagree with Jürgen. I think one of them is the idea that the era of American ascendancy is over. I think that's a bit premature to say. I think the U.S., by and large, has weathered this crisis. reasonably well. I think it has done better than Europe in dealing with this crisis. I think there are many things in favor of the US. There's the shale oil revolution, which is a game changer, really. I think that is going to transform the US position in the world. There is the consumer comeback, there is the reshoring of manufacturing, all these things. There is a recovery underway. All the numbers are looking quite decent, that even the deficit levels have come down quite sharply from like 10% of GDP in 2009 to now 5.7% of GDP. And it's going to go down further to about 4 or under. And I really don't think deficits are really an issue, a big issue going forward for America, or even the debt, I think, can be stabilized at a reasonably tolerable level in the years ahead. One of the things I noticed that Jürgen in his book, he talks about Europe versus America. In many ways, it's often juxtaposed. And the view comes across that America is worse than it looks and Europe is better than it looks. I'm not sure that's the case. I think, in fact, the opposite is closer to the truth. There is an essay which I think he wrote, contributed to BT last year, February, where he cited the IMF's forecast of 1.8% growth for the US and a mild recession in Europe, and he suggested that it's probably too optimistic for the US and too pessimistic for Europe. Well, it was the other way around. In the event, the US grew at 2.8% in 2012, and Europe did not grow in a single quarter of that year and ended up in recession. And I suspect Jürgen, you've been a bit hard on American policymakers and a bit soft on European policymakers. I really think that Europe's pursuit of austerity since 2010 has been an unmitigated disaster. I mean, every target has been missed, every fiscal target, every growth target. You have, what, 56% youth unemployment in Spain, 26% of unemployment in Greece, 65% youth unemployment in Greece, 5 years of a contracting economy, double-digit unemployment in France, a fiasco in Cyprus. I really think the European policymakers have a lot to answer for. I mean, the Eurozone policymakers at any rate, and to a large extent the German leadership as well. But okay, that said, Jürgen, you're right in terms of direction, but not on timing. Europe is recovering. The PMI numbers are looking good. US is also in recovery mode. I think what I would like to hear from you is how these recoveries can synergize with each other.
Sorry.
How the two recoveries in the Europe and the US can synergize. We saw that the problems of the subprime sector in the US were linked to problems of the debt in Europe. And I think the opposite is also true. When there's a recovery in the US, there will be a recovery. It'll help the recovery in Europe. And I think we are looking, I know there are lots of problems on the way. There's Syria and all these things. But we're looking at a scenario which I would consider better than we've seen for the last 5 years. And I would love to hear your views on that. But I thoroughly enjoyed reading your book, even though I didn't agree. It stimulated me and made me think, and thank you, Jürgen.
Thank you, Ambassador and Professor Muller, distinguished guests, friends. I'm so honored to be on the panel today. Like Professor Arno, I completely agree. This book is wonderfully accessible. I read Professor Jagdish's foreword. He picked 2 topics. So I was looking through the various chapters, and I could easily read just a vignette, as Si Yang said, and I picked Singapore. Why Singapore? Because that's a topic which I'm familiar with, running the Business Federation, which is the largest apex chamber in Singapore. Now, the series of essays in the book, though they were written from 4 years ago, I think presents issues that are as fresh today. I think you fast forward to 2013 and you apply those observations to developments in Singapore, And you can change the title of the book to what do we see, a Singapore economy that is in transition, similarly affected by debt, similarly affected by scarcity, but in a different way. I think the Singapore economy is undergoing a very painful restructuring. I think companies have to adjust to a new reality. They know how to, the government is good at managing resources, water, capital, but now a very critical resource that needs to be managed, and that is labor, and to a lesser extent land. And this adjustment is most difficult for our small companies, and the end result is that some of them will not survive. Many of them, some of them with the resources and with the gumption will seek growth outside of Singapore, and I think they will be successful. Now economically, this adjustment is not bad, because I think it takes away scarce resources to reallocate to those who can use them better. But I think the downside of that, in terms of job displacement, the downside of having to manage unemployment, the downside of having to manage older workers who are less skilled, will have to be given a lot of attention in Singapore. I think the second thing is that the government will have to look at the management of these resources as in a much better way. I think they have applied economic theory to managing resources, applied to COE allocation in terms of pricing, but how to manage resources in terms of labor. Right now, there's a little bit of a black hole as far as Ministry of Manpower, so policy changes will have to be fine-tuned to allocate that sort of scarce resources in Singapore. Now on that is quite a different story. First, I think recently the financial market has been severely impacted by the withdrawal of capital from some emerging markets. You've seen this has impacted currencies, the rupee, rupiah, and the ringgit, and it's placing a huge dilemma for central bank as they try to manage growth and at the same time to worry about inflation. Now, these are the macro issues, but on the downstream side, there are impacts on companies, because potentially what will happen is that the borrowing cost for companies will increase, and access to capital becomes scarcer. Now, I wanted to relate, and this again thinking about Singapore, because in your chapter on Singapore, you talk about how we have been successful in terms of managing a hub strategy. But in the area of debt, which is a strategic advantage for Singapore, yesterday we had the Singapore-Korea Forum, and I was lucky to be one of the participants, and one of the member is a Korean, very important Korean politician. He was chairman of the National Policy Committee. So during the intervention, he talked about Singapore-Korea economic collaboration, and he keeps talking about financial cooperation. He keeps talking about GIC. He keeps talking about coming to Temasek to see our leaders to talk about cooperation. And I keep making the different intervention to say that my association are all about SMEs. Come to talk to me and collaborate with our SMEs. He was not interested. And he said he wanted to come again, and this morning at 12 o'clock, he came again to see me and my chairman. And again, he said about this collaboration, and he mentioned about the Koreans have got they were successful in tendering the Myanmar new airport, the international airport. And I said, well, that's very good. How about, some of our companies can be your subcontractors? No, he was not interested. He was interested in project financing. He was interested for us to introduce him to, again, Temasek, again, GIC, to look at financing and looking at capital. So I think therein lies the fact that he's a very smart chap, very influential. I've told him about our SME, but clearly that's not a strategic advantage as far as he's concerned. Where he's looking for, and he's Korea, he's looking at Singapore, where we can find not just the market, but the financing. And I think in there, in terms of managing scarcity, and this is something that we have in Asia, that could be a strength for Singapore if we can use it well. Thank you.
Thank you. We've had a few interesting comments, including a few bombs thrown by Vikram. Can I now open the discussion to the floor and invite...
I actually want to read the book. And I thank you very much for those who disagree, because it's actually good for an author. The more people disagree, the more interest there is about the book. Vikram actually asked a specific question, so before I turn to Racine, I may say that in my universe, the US and Europe are following diverging courses. They are moving away from each other. I don't think it's actually surprising, because why should they in the long run stay so close together as they did until a few decades ago? The US is now being more or less a bilingual country with Spain, Spanish language. We can see the US have other interests than Europe in many respects. And I do not believe, even if I think it's a good idea, that we can make a North Atlantic free trade area because of divergent interest. And that actually gets me to one of the Racine's point, that one of the reasons that that is the case is actually shale oil and shale gas. That means that the United States is interested in a high oil price, because with access to shale gas, that will make US more competitive vis-a-vis Europe. And Europe will have to import the oil. Same for China. But that aspect will actually push the two continents, so to speak, away from each other. Vikram also commented upon the free market, as did Racine. I will actually say that my criticism is not so much about the free market. My criticism is about the economic model anchored in the free market. I think the free market is good, but we don't have the free market anymore. If you look for all major branches or sectors in the economy, it's dominated by a few big players. That actually means that there's very little competition. If I look back and remember what Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan said when they actually deregulated, I'm absolutely certain that if they look upon the consequences of the deregulation, they will say that was not at all what we wanted. We wanted actually to liberate forces, and now we see a much more concentrated economic sectors. You say, tell me where I'm wrong about resources. I don't know. You comment upon one sector. I actually have 5 sectors of scarcities. So I will say that I will take it for granted that you agree with the scarcity in the 4 other sectors. Thank you for agreeing with that. The first sector about energy. You may be right that shale gas and oil will actually be a game changer. I have my doubts. There's no doubt that shale gas and oil will be an important source of energy in the years to come. But I think that there are so many barriers, ecology, cost, transport, so I'm absolutely not certain that it will be so crucial as many people say. So give me a couple of years more to answer your question, because that combined with all the, let's say, observations, let's call it disagreement, points to weaknesses in the book, will actually prompt me to write the next book. Thank you.
American approach. Use the monetary policy, use the fiscal policy, less austerity, right?
Yeah, less austerity, for sure.
Would you agree with that, or do you think that in the Eurozone's specific circumstances, this approach of austerity was warranted?
To put it very briefly, the Eurozone has the pain behind it. The US has the pain ahead of it. The Eurozone debt-GDP ratio is stabilizing and starting to fall. The deficit to GDP ratio is actually falling strongly. While in the US, you can see that debt is going up And as I started out by saying, with my lower deck debt has to be repaid sooner or later in one way or another. And the US is going to face that problem, and it will be an acute problem. Just one more comment. I was traveling in the US in July. I can say that apart from one or two other countries of the 56 I have visited in my lifetime, I never seen such a run-down infrastructure as you see in the US. It seems to me impossible for a country to stage an economic recovery with an infrastructure that does not work. All my flights were cancelled or delayed. I didn't get my luggage in the airport, no electricity to the planes before they started the engine. From Chicago city center to the airport, 25 kilometers, the opposite lane of the freeway, 3 lanes, absolutely blocked, and on the top of it, United Airlines threw my luggage away. Good luck to them. Up with US and Europe with regard to technology and innovation, and the large majority of research development in Asia is actually applied technology. The test for Asia will come when the catch-up phase is over, and that will still take some years. Then we will see whether Asia will actually be able to move into fundamental research and break new grounds. I think, judged by history, if you look back, that Asia will be able to do that turnaround. But the proof of the eating is actually in the pudding. So we have to wait and see whether that's actually possible. One of the barriers for that is that to get a real breakthrough in technology innovation, you have to free dissemination of knowledge. And in many Asian countries, that is not the case.
They might have a lot of innovative ideas, but these ideas are some of them come out of the developing world. Whether it's pharmaceuticals, whether it's electronic hardware or software, the companies, Western companies are doing this in China, they're doing this in Korea, they're doing this in India, they're doing this all over the place. So while the companies themselves may be European or American, the theater of innovation is not necessarily Europe or the United States. And a lot of innovation is happening in Asia, including in Singapore, How can I not mention Singapore? Singapore is a center for R&D for a lot of companies, so it's happening everywhere.
In my world, we are moving from a money-wise economy, a materialistic economy, into a value-based economy, a value-based societies. And of course, that means that it will actually be anchored in culture. And I think that many companies will have to, and some of them already are, building a cultural profile. Not only a company esprit de corps, or whatever you will call it, but make it clear what the companies are actually standing for. We will get the political enterprise and the political consumer. And to my mind, that follows from the scarcities, pushing us towards another kind of consumption. And if you look at the science of economics, if we can call economics a science, you will see that they are now starting to discover that there's something called psychology, anthropology, sociology, and the brain research. And that actually tells us a lot about an human behavior that is less controlled by economic incentives than what used to be the conventional wisdom. And what is moving in there is actually based upon culture, values, norms, ethics. There are a lot of studies saying that people actually get more happy by doing something for others and with others than material or materialistic consumption.
I think Vikram has a...
hydrocarbons that exist in the natural world. If you go back to the concept of peak oil, which is I think maybe 50, maybe now 70 years old, it is not true that we will run out of hydrocarbons, because hydrocarbons are actually one of building blocks of life. They exist. So the concept of scarcity really has to be looked at through an economic lens. And in my view, in a broad sense, is that all that shale will do is that it will displace some less affordable or more troublesome hydrocarbon that will be left for another day to be exploited. So the consequence really of shale is indeed immediately on North America, where it will, I think, result in the short term in a much more self-sufficient North American energy system. Exports, not yet, because A, the terminals still have to be built, and B, the government still has to pass the legislation. Singapore, I think, is in a good place because we have an FTA with the US. But the immediate impact is that all the other hydrocarbons that used to be imported into North America are now looking for homes, or they stay in the ground. And they are starting to come to Europe and to Asia. And fortunately or unfortunately, Asia is the highest price. It's unfortunate because it's the highest price. We're paying the highest price here in Singapore. But it's fortunate in the sense that it's drawing all this loose hydrocarbon our way, because the highest price does bring it. So it's a matter of time that the arbitrage will result in more hydrocarbons coming here. It's little comfort for many of our companies here, because we all face this. And although I come from Shell and we obviously have an upstream sector, I can tell you that in Singapore, we face some of our highest, when we benchmark our plants, our energy costs are the highest in the group. Why? Because our cost of energy in Singapore are the highest in the world. So I think that's the impact of shale. I think the other thing which we should look at is because this mix of hydrocarbons that will be produced and consumed as a result of the technological and market discoveries from shale means that the mix again of hydrocarbons will change. The impact on climate change we have to watch very carefully, because if the consequence is indeed that we end up with more gas and a more efficient carbon to energy ratio, then that will be good for climate change. But if it ends up with us actually burning more coal, for example, then we have to brace ourselves for more issues to do with climate change, because there will be more carbon and more greenhouse gas.
In this panel discussion, could you please join me in thanking our panelists for their excellent contributions?
Yeah, let me thank all of you for coming here tonight and share this big moment for me. I have been very encouraged by the comments, and it's fantastic for me that so many persons have already read the book. And as I say, that it will actually prompt me to start to think about writing a new book. But the problem is, of course, that I have to be aware what is this book, so I do not contradict myself. But I've always said that you should make a forecast about how the world will look in about 25 years' time, because then you will not be held accountable, because people will have forgotten, or you may have passed away, or whatever it is. And here I've actually ventured a little bit the opposite, making some forecasts, some predictions about the immediate future. So I will actually have to follow them every day to see whether they conform to what I've expected, and if not, I'll be angry. Thank you very much for coming. Thanks a lot to all of you.